Hello and welcome to the explainer video for the custom AJAX calls advanced job, which you can find in the load example job editor at any time by searching for it. So this job, to give a fair bit of warning, is an advanced explainer. We're going to be using custom JavaScript, AJAX calls, PHP, SQL code, etc. So if you're not a coder, this video probably won't be of much use to you. The reason why this video exists is because the specific task that we're performing in this video is actually very difficult to achieve using anything other than just standard hand coding. And the reason for that is this job actually uses an AJAX query to call a custom processing page, which itself calls a database call, which then also creates a calculation. So in other words, RackForms has an AJAX module, which we're actually using in this job to perform very simple population of in this case, a dropdown. But that's just fetching a value from a database based on some related value. Again, what we're doing here is actually performing a custom calculation and even a custom database call. So let's jump in. So the basic idea here is this. We have a database table, and it has some very simple content in here. It has a primary key value, and then it has a value field, which this could be a stand-in for basically anything that could have one or more values. So you could picture this as zip code, a player in a team database, or I should say a position in a team database, so multiple pitchers, catchers, etc. It has a note field, and we're going to see why we have this note field in a second. It has a rate field, which we're going to use for our calculation. And then finally, it has kind of a related value to this value field right here, which is, in other words, showing what happens when we have multiple records that might be returned by something. So how does this actually work? Well, the basic idea is this. We need to actually call a custom AJAX logical code bit that actually performs a calculation and a database call for us. So this is the page that actually handles that. We have a page called calculaterate.php. The point, the reason for existence for this particular form is to do those two things, to essentially receive an AJAX request to perform a calculation, but to also get a value from a custom database call, which we have right here. Now we're going to get to that in a second, but let's talk about how we actually call this page in the first place. So it turns out this all starts with this button right here. So not a submit button, to be clear, but a standard basic button, which has an extra attribute / event code attached to it for onClick. So I have a button. The onClick event is going to call a function called callAJAX. So this is what fires the whole thing off. So where's callAJAX defined? Well, it's actually defined right here. So if I look at my custom code block that I've added here, we actually have two different things here. So the first is I have a span which I've created and given a custom ID to called total rate. We'll see why in just a second. But then we also have a JavaScript block which has our function callAJAX. Now, here's the thing about this, just to be clear, this is all boilerplate right here. If you want to use this code on your own forms, the two things you'd want to change are where you actually write any of the final values from AJAX call to, and possibly the name of the page that you call. But everything else in this can be left completely alone. The point of this code here is to do something incredibly simple. It's going to use jQuery to basically create a JSON serialized version of all the fields on this form, and then it posts them to the page that we want. So it posts to calculaterate.php, basically a JSON object that contains a name value pair for all the fields in this form. The other bit right here where we actually write the value to would all depend if you're actually returning a value from this. Maybe you're inserting data, in which case you wouldn't need to return value. But in this case we're actually creating like a calculated rate. So I'm actually writing to this span so I can show my users a value, but then I'm also writing to a form field, a hidden field called final value. And so that's what this guy is right here. So again, what you would actually change, I guess probably easiest to say, is just these bits in red. So I'm going to say possible change. And by the way, because we're still finishing this job, you'll actually see these comments in your version of the job as well if you're running this locally. But we basically have this. We have these possible changed fields right here, and that's it. You wouldn't need to change anything else about this form with, okay, maybe the exception of this guy right here, because maybe you'd actually want to change this and not show it. The thing is, if you don't actually write anything to this, the span really isn't going to do anything, but just to kind of point that out. Okay, so excuse me, we have an AJAX call now, which is going to serialize the form, and it's going to send it to calculaterate.php. So what's important about this is that we're writing a structured bit of JSON to this page, this calculaterate.php. And so what it really comes down about is, well, how do you actually process a custom bit of code like this in RackForms? Well, it turns out that when we build a page in RackForms, there's a bunch of code that gets added to that page that's beyond what you have in the standard form fields. And so, for example, we have an HTML head block. We have custom PHP that does form validation. We have all this extra code that gets written. However, in many cases, you don't want that at all. And certainly not in the case of a page whose job it is to just consume a JSON blob of data and then return a value back for us after performing a database query. And so that's exactly what's happening here by way of page export mode. Basically, what's happening is this. When we select form fields only from page export mode, the only code that's actually output is the explicit code that we add in terms of form fields. There's no HTML head, there's no CSS blocks, there's nothing except for the actual elements that we add to our form. And because by default, a code block and a database query don't really add HTML to a page, this page, when we run it, is technically empty, right? If I look at the source code for the page, there's nothing here. So that's the first thing. The other thing that you probably want to check is page not required right here. This is, after all, a processing page, so we don't want it to be something that gets tallied up in the you're submitting the form, have you visited all required pages? So we generally check this to make sure that this page is just ignored by the logic that says have you fill out all pages. Okay, so at this point then, we're ready to talk about the actual processing of the page. Now remember, all this is fired off by clicking this button, which calls call AJAX, which is defined as serializing the entire form and sending a JSON object, essentially a string, off to calculaterate.php. So how do we actually process that? Well, the first thing that we do is we go into a custom code block and we decode the JSON data. So I'm going to basically create an object and I'm going to decode it from this serialized string, and then we're going to print it off as an object, and then we're going to exit out. So let's just see what this actually looks like. So I'm going to, pardon me, not run that page, but run this page. And let's actually look then at the request as it comes through. And we'll see exactly what it does. So I'm looking at network right here. So basically I would expect that when I click this button, it's going to take any values that I put in here and it's going to send it off by way of AJAX request. So let's press it, and sure enough, here it is. So I have a post AJAX request off to calculaterate.php. The parameters that it sent is basically this. It's a field called data, which has essentially a JSON string of these fields. And so what we're going to do in the PHP code then, as we saw right here, is we're going to essentially deserialize that. Or excuse me, we're going to serialize it, deserialize the data into a PHP object. That's, by the way, what JSON decode does, is it'll take a JSON string, which post data is exactly what that contains. So we have a post field called data, and it's going to turn that into a PHP object. And so that's exactly what we get here then. So basically we print that out. So here it is. I have a standard class object, and it has these fields. So it has a field called A, which has a value of nothing. It has community, which has a value of nothing, etc., etc. So essentially what's going to happen is anytime I add a value to one of these form fields and then perform that calculation, that is now going to be the value that's assigned with that property. So the form field called A gets a property called A and has a value of 10. Num passengers, so community. So here it is. Our field B is blank right now. It could also be a text value. So this is a text value. So basically, this is just boilerplate code, and it's giving us a standard object in return. Now here's the thing. as my PHP coders will know, because I now get a standard object back from this, let me kind of scoot this up here, I can actually do interesting things with it. For example, I can go in and I'm actually going to comment this out right here. I am going to, actually, matter of fact, let me comment the whole row out, because in the end, we actually do want this to return a value. And I'll just say uncomment to see the raw object being created from the post. I can do things like this. I know that this object has a field called B. So I can, for example, get the number of passengers, which is this form field B right here, and I can just get it from obj B. And then we just have some other things that you can uncomment here just to see those values coming through. I can also get the zip code. So what was the zip code? Well, we have a form field called A, so obj A is going to be, it's going to be essentially the zip code that's answered. Now here's the other cool part about this form. So this is clearly calling a PHP function called getZip. There's no getZip defined here anywhere. So where's getZip defined? Well, it turns out that's one of our core features of the RackForms query module. So the query module in RackForms, make this just a little bit bigger here. The query module in RackForms generally just runs a database query based on some value, and it returns the results in a result set variable, in this case named Q1. However, I can actually change this to be a function call. And then it's just a wrapper around this database call so that we can actually return a result variable from it. So that's exactly what this code does. This code basically says call the database function that's wrapped in a function called getZip. I'm going to pass it one value, which in this case is that A object's value. So in other words, our zip code, or what would stand in for the zip code, and then go ahead and pass that to the query. So here you notice we have a parameterized query, a prepared statement. So we're selecting all from zip where the value is equal to some string. So if I put a 1 in, I'm going to return this row. If I put value 2, I'm going to return this row, so on and so forth. And that's literally it then, right? We go ahead and we return a result set back to us, and if we look at our code then, I could see that res is now going to be essentially this object right here. It's going to be an array that contains one record for every one of those matching rows that we just queried. So for example, I can then go in and say, grab me the first rate value. So rate is going to be equal to res, so this is $res 0, and then the rate field. And actually, I should probably, I'm going to actually copy these real quick, because we actually do something like that. So this, by the way, it could be dynamic. This array is going to be whatever you actually queried in this database query and you're returning right here. But then the really cool thing is, to tie this all together then, is now we can actually get two different values from two different sources. So one source is we're getting the zip data from the database. So let me make these comments a little bit clearer. Get zip database from the database. That's one thing. However, this is getting data from the AJAX request object, right? So two different sources of data here, getting individual form fields from that. Here we're getting the data from the database, and then we can go through and we can combine those as needed, because these are, after all, now just regular PHP values and variables. So I could say rate is equal to the database query's rate field, passengers is equal to the object that we passed in from the AJAX request, and then I can just multiply those two out and something like that. And so now that I have that, the end result is this. I could take one value here, put it in here, get rate, and I return a string back to us, right? Because after all, that's what we're doing. We're echoing out a $ appended to the value, and so then that's what displays in that little span item that we created. So that's basically it. Obviously, again, this is an advanced technique right here. I wish, and I mean this, maybe we'll fix this at some point in terms of feature, but I wish there truly was an easier way of creating this type of logic. In other words, advanced AJAX calls that are just doing arbitrary things. The only problem is that this type of work could arguably be better handled with an API layer, just like with SOAP requests. And we actually have a web service module already in RackForms that probably better handle this. Obviously, the downside to that is if you're creating web services, often that's more work up front. to do it. And so in those cases where you don't want to create a web service, you just want to do raw data access like we're doing right here, this is sometimes the best option. But because of the way this works, like the form serialization part and then calling a custom page, which can do essentially arbitrary commands, in this case, for example, calling out to a database call, we just figure for right now, it's best to leave this in your hands as far as this processing page. The good news is, though, is that almost all this job, though, is in fact boilerplate. So in other words, if I were to create a new version of this job that has this, essentially this requirement, right, that uses a AJAX call to some arbitrary code, essentially what I would do is this. I would build my form as I normally would. I would then just literally copy and paste all of this code, being mindful of possibly changing any of these fields where I possible change. So again, changing the page name, maybe changing where you're writing the result to, basically doing that, and then creating a processing page. And you could even copy this, just call it calculaterate.php, and then to that, just add this code at very minimum. So in other words, the code that basically creates an object out of your JSON data. And then it's up to you to write any code that you need to, for example, call custom functions, or maybe call an API layer of your own, maybe perform some kind of image translation. I mean, whatever it happens to be, you could do it here. And that's basically it. So that's why we made our video. That's why this is a demo job, is that there's absolutely nothing stopping us from just using this as a complete boilerplate solution for doing all the custom work that you need. So we'll leave it at that for now. As always, any questions or comments, please let us know at info@rackforms.com. And thanks for watching.